Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
Stories of creepypasta are great, but does anyone have any good true creepy stories? Episode 3. About 5 years ago, some friends and I went camping in Oconee State Park in South Carolina. We were in high school and went with our school ROTC instructor. This guy was in his 50s but still a Knox. He was a sergeant major while in the army and was the definition of man. So, the first night camping it was really cold, so we decided to sleep around the fire. We woke up all at same time in the middle of the night to the smell of wet dogs and rotten flesh. We decided it might just be the damp leaves and we slept through the rest of the night. Well, we woke up the next morning and there were paw prints all over the place. I'm not talking just around the outskirts of the site, I mean there were paw prints 4 feet away from where I laid my head that night. We were all pretty creeped out, so we decided to head into town to get some lunch. We stayed in town the rest of the day and headed back to the site around dusk. My friends and I are in the back of the truck as we drive down the gravel road to the site. Then all of a sudden, Sergeant Major slammed on the brakes, and we came to a stop in the middle of the road. We all jumped up and looked over the cab to see what it was. Standing in the middle of the road was a hairless animal, around 50 pounds, standing on its hind legs. While still on its back legs, it walked to the side of the road and let out this god-awful screeching noise. It darted into the woods and left us all frozen in fear. Then we smelt it. It was the same terrible smell from the night before. We got into the cab, and I saw Sergeant Major like I had never seen him. I was absolutely terrified. The animal/creature we saw shook him to his core. We drove in silence for the rest of the ride back to the site. When we got there he told us that we were leaving and to pack everything up. None of us have been back since and Sergeant Major won't let ROTC camp there anymore. We agreed that what we saw looked like a mix between a bobcat and a coyote but walked like a bear on its back legs. We named it the Catiote. A few of my friends who hadn't heard the story decided to go up there one day and said the entire area gave off a really creepy vibe and decided to leave. After I told them the story, it sealed the deal that none of us will be going back. When I was a teenager I was big into skateboarding and building ramps. There was a neighborhood being built behind mine and I'd go over there on the weekends and get scrap wood and bring it back to my house. You had to go through a little bit of wood and cross a creek to get there. I went one day by myself and when I crossed the creek and started walking through the woods to the construction site I could hear a man talking. I stood still to try to hear what he was saying. It was getting louder as if he was coming through the woods towards me and I finally heard what he was saying and he made a little jingle singing, "I'm going to get you." I couldn't hear any leaves crunching and I never saw anyone. I ran like hell and slipped while I was trying to climb up the muddy bank in the creek. I don't believe in ghosts or anything but that's one thing that stuck with me that I can't explain. We used to own a racetrack in Ohio years ago, but we lived in southeast PA. You had to take the turnpike to get there in any reasonable amount of time, and one of the times my mother, my sister and I were together to go meet my stepdad who was driving separately with a trailer to haul equipment. We got off at an exit after paying a toll and went off into a strip mall with a bunch of rink-drink looking buildings. Not dirty, just faded pastel colors, didn't even look like there was a town nearby. They had dinner, though, and we hadn't eaten since we left, 4 hours before, so we stopped in. The food sucked and was completely tasteless. People stared at us the whole time. It wasn't dark like a cave, just not a ton of windows. There were some, enough for ambient light. Like Denny's if the power went out, that sort of thing. And an unreasonable number of people, we noticed, had bandages on them. The only person who said a word to us was the girl who took our order, who also rang us up at the end. We decided not eating was better than going back there, so we wrote down the exit in a little journal we'd been keeping in the glove compartment, so we knew not to make that mistake again. A couple of hours later we get to the track and my stepdad asks how everything went. We said it was uneventful but told him we'd recorded a real whopper for the journal and not to take the exit we'd marked. He gets really excited and we're all kind of wondering why. He's actually said the words before, "I hate eating. It takes too much time and gets in the way of me living my life," so our less than stellar review definitely wasn't a motivating factor. He tells us he thinks we ate ghost food and that the people in the diner were vampires. He wouldn't stop talking about it for like 10 minutes and it was making my sister uncomfortable, so my mom did an about-face and tried logic king him away from it. We argued that the food had no reason to suck, they could have easily killed us, and nobody could recall ever seeing a movie where the wound, left by whatever bit the person to make them vampires in the first place, still existed on their body. He got less excited and left it alone. We have the race weekend, it's time to drive all the way back. He asked me if I wanted to come with him, since he had to drive alone the way there. I say sure. 2 hours in, he pulls off. I think it's weird because we ate a gigantic breakfast before we left, and I know he's anti-eating. I didn't recognize it at first coming from the other direction, but eventually it occurs to me he's going to the diner's exit. He wants to see it for himself. He stops to pay the toll, doesn't mention our story, he asks if there's a diner at the exit to make sure he has the right one, you can't see it from the ramp. The guy says there was one, but it burned down. Holy stuff. Okay, so there weren't vampires, but what a coincidence. We just eat there and then right after, in the span of 2.5 days, they have a freak accident. This almost intrigues him more than the supernatural bit, and I am 100% on board checking it out. We drive over to same humdrum strip mall, except where we went to eat it's just this charred mess. Not like with holes in it, it wasn't a wooden frame in pieces like a cartoon, you just could seriously tell there was damage. No vehicles, no tape, I'd assume they'd at least test it for being a crime, and they'd cleaned the area around it well. We go to get back on the turnpike, and these poor toll guys are stuck in a booth hardly bigger than they are, so it's the same dude getting back on, hard to explain, but it's a short ramp, straight road perpendicular to the turnpike, guy's booth, lots of straight, then you can turn into the strip, so you see him again and then fork back. Anyway, my stepdad's like, I thought you said there was a dinner there. Guy says, there was, like I told you, burned down. He asked if they'd figured out yet what caused it, was it a grease fire or what, that kind of thing. The guy says, yet? Yeah, it had to have been in the last 2 or 3 days, they didn't investigate it. It wasn't on the news? Then the guy says, oh, we know what happened. It was on the news when it happened, 8 years ago. It sounds ridiculous, and cliché, and there are tons of stories like it. I know what I saw, it was the same exit, the same distance from the road, same building save for one. I don't expect anyone to ever believe me, which is why I don't usually share it. Plus, there's no way to prove it because I moved to Florida by the time I was old enough to drive, and I don't have the exit number anymore. It was after Somerset, which I remember because of 9/11, and before Wheeling. But that's almost an hour-long difference no matter which way you split it, so even that's no help. All that I really think happened is that the place burned down like a bad guy while we were gone and that guy's just an idiot. I don't think it burned down in the past and I don't think that I ate ghost food. But my stomach dropped like crazy and it's still a weird coincidence, especially given how good a job they did cleaning up the site, and how quiet everything was around it. It really did look lost to time. So glad I have a story to share the same day I created my Reddit account. About 4 years ago I was sleeping and woke up randomly to see a person standing next to my bed. This person was clearly female, but very petite, perhaps a teenager or just tiny in stature. She was facing away from me and had her shoulder cocked up to her cheek, like the way you sometimes see people holding phones. Her hair was in a low ponytail. There was nothing surreal or ghostly about her. She appeared exactly as you would imagine a person would if you were to be woken in a dark room, somewhat illuminated by moonlight. There was no mistaking the fact that someone else was standing only a couple of feet away from my bed. I jolted upright immediately. Shock is putting it mildly. I remember my heart was pounding, pounding, pounding. The worst part about it was, she heard me sit up, and reacted, turning her crooked head around to face me, as if equally surprised to see me as I was her. I was so scared I actually closed my eyes, like they do in the movies, thinking that when I opened then she would be gone, and I could chalk it up to some kind of half-dreaming state. Nope. She was still there, staring at me. I started to fumble for the lamp on my nightstand. It felt like God forever, I couldn't take my eyes off her. I was so nervous that the noise would prompt her to come towards me, or something. When I finally switched it on, she was gone. I called my boyfriend, hysterically crying and begging him to come over. He refused and said I hadn't actually seen what I thought I had seen. I slept with the light on for 3 entire weeks, I was so scared. I remember I told my mom the next day and she advised me to search every closet in my apartment for squatters, which is perhaps even more terrifying than a ghost appearance. Thanks, Mom. Not my story, but my boyfriend, who for the sake of the story we will call Bob, shared this one with me. When he was about 8 to 10 years old, he isn't sure of the age, he would receive calls on the house phone from some mysterious guy. The guy would call when Bob was the only one home, before his brother who was 3 years older than him would come back from school and when his parents were working. This guy would curse Bob out and tell him to shut up and to do whatever I say. The guy told Bob that he knew where he lived, he knew where Bob's parents worked, and he knew that Bob was alone. The guy told Bob that if he told anyone that he was calling Bob's home he would kill his parents or him. Guess whatever was more terrifying that day. Being the young, scared kid at the time, Bob complied and would do things like take off his clothes while on the phone or dance around in the living room. Bob didn't tell me the full extent of the stranger's demands, but a part of me really doesn't want to know. So, Bob entertained this guy for some time, again didn't specify how long, until one day Bob's brother comes home and sees Bob on the phone. Bob's brother asks who it is and after getting off the phone an apprehensive Bob finally explains to his older brother the details about this mysterious caller. When Bob's older brother found out, the next day he came home early for the call and with a few friends on speaker phone told the guy to go off and that they would find him and with their posse make his life a living hell. Bob lived in a predominantly Italian neighborhood where the mob life was very real. After they confronted the guy on the phone, the calls stopped, and they were never harassed again. It makes me wonder if the guy on the phone someone in the neighborhood was or if it was some random guy across the country who got his thrills off these type of phone calls. Bob hasn't really gone into much more depth about the nature of these calls and everything I've stated above is all the information he has given to me. It's kind of scary because it really makes you wonder if he was just a random selection out of the phone book or if this were someone who could quite literally watch him from a window. It gives me the heebie-jeebies because we are now living in the same home that he received those calls. Parents want us to take care of it until they decide to sell it, and there are some pretty creepy folks around here. I used to work for my dad, who was partially self-employed doing regular maintenance and floor refinishing for a childcare program called Head Start. The one center was in an old school, which was built not too long after the turn of the century, and served as a church function building in addition to housing Head Start and another childcare. We always did floors over the summer. Anyone who has stripped and waxed floors knows that when you're putting the coating back on, it's quiet and relaxing. We were the only people in the building since it was a midsummer weekend, and yet it fell off, even before you entered, like someone was watching from the second floor windows. So here we are, making slow progress across this huge room, when we hear a thing upstairs and stop. Then it sounded like someone was skipping across the room and back, a few times, and stopped again. So, we finished the layer and went upstairs. Upstairs were a few classrooms with shelves, blocking direct movement from one end to the other, filled with supplies from the classes. Nobody was up there, so we closed the doors and went downstairs to start the other room. Once again, this sound started, but this time I sprinted upstairs. The sound stopped before I reached the hall, but all of the doors were open at various angles. We didn't hear the sound anymore that summer, but my dad asked the childcare advisor from the other end of the building if they heard any weird noises. She said no, but that one day they were sitting down for snacks and a couple kids were staring in the corner. The aide asked them what they were looking at and one of the kids asked, "Why can't that girl eat with us?" The aide looked around, then asked, "What girl?" And the kid points at the corner and says, "The little girl in the white dress." I literally haven't set foot in that building since, and I have no desire to do so. I used to think ghosts were for scary stories, but I have trouble believing this isn't real. Sorry for any mistakes, I'm on mobile. Edit. Tried to change all floss back to floors because my keyboard is an idiot. When I was younger I used to have horrible night terrors. Ones where I would wake up, but they would still be going on, voices would yell at me saying they were going to kill me, etc. One night I was sent to bed early because I did something stupid, I don't remember what, and then everyone went downstairs while I was supposed to be asleep. So of course, I'm not going to sleep because I'm still wide awake listening to my parents downstairs talking about random stuff. Around 9:30 to 10 I start to feel really strange and feel like something is in the hallway, and it feels very innocuous. I get a sudden urge to get up and go into the hallway to see what is there. My room is set up in such a way that I couldn't see the hallway from my bedroom because there was a wall that had my closet and then my door. So, I got out of bed, slid along the wall to my doorway and looked down the hallway to see what is out there. I will never forget what I saw. It was a lengthy, cloudy black figure with eyes that were semi-glowing red. It was crouched in a menacing manner, with exceptionally long fingers. I was frozen to the spot, locking eyes with this figure. I knew that it hated me with every ounce of its being, and started to move towards me, like an ape. As it was moving towards me, I heard my parents start to come upstairs and the figure melted into the floor, but not before letting me know that it would find me later on. I bolted back into my bed, crying a little from the shock and hatred I knew was placed on me by that figure. Fast forward to college, where I am recounting this tale to a few friends of mine and decide to Google pictures to see if anything looks familiar. It took us a long time, but eventually I came across a photo of the same figure I had encountered and nearly had a full-blown panic attack. They are known as shadow people or shadow men, and they can be benign or extremely harmful. I still wonder until this day when I will see it again, and if it will finish the job it meant to do nearly 10 years ago. Creepiest thing will forever be the man who watched me at my window. It's nothing paranormal, but honestly. I was texting my girlfriend, playing a game, and I heard rustling outside my window. Keep in mind I live in the basement. I didn't have any curtains, and I turned off my iPod. I could see someone actually staring at me. This went on for about 10 minutes. I texted my little sister to get the bat and turn on the lights upstairs. After he saw the lights, he ran off. That's the creepiest one for me that is a real-life person, non-paranormal type thing. A shared experience is me and my best friend. We were at her house, chilling in the computer room. I can't remember, it was so long ago. We heard a huge thump come from her room above us. Like, a heavy thud. We looked at each other, confused. All of her siblings were downstairs with us. We decided, let's check it out. We grabbed some airsoft guns, a bat, and she picked up a bag of bagels, kid logic, right? We get upstairs, getting a little apprehensive about being upstairs. Her room door was open, no big deal until we saw her oak dresser moved about a foot. It takes two people on either side to lift it. She yelped and pointed at something, so I looked, and I swear to God, there was a girl under her bed. Not her sister, just a girl. She threw the bag of bagels at her, and we booked our assess downstairs. To this day, we have no idea what that was. Last one. Though it's not super creepy or anything. Same best friend, same house. I'm putting her name as Ash for the sake of simplicity at this point. We were hanging out in the computer room again, on Neopets and Gaia Online this time. Her cat got outside, so she ran to go after it. I stayed inside, and when Ash got back, the fire alarms were going off. Now, her parents tend to burn things, so we kind of shrugged it off. It was hot in the house, but no big deal, it's just another hot August day in Colorado. Nope. When the alarms kept going, we left the room to look for her brother. He was watching Dragon Ball Z. Hey, are you cooking anything? Nope. He continued watching TV like nothing was going on. Ash and I smelled smoke. She opened the basement door and walked down part of the way. I stood in the doorway, and you could see the flames arching over the bottom steps. It's kind of hard to explain. Ash looked up at me, screamed, "Get everyone out of the house," and booked it upstairs. We found everyone, got them out, waited for the fire department. Not important, just a house fire. Well, it was only recently that Ash got to see the report on it. It said that we all should have died. It was a miracle the floors were able to hold all of us up. When I was little, I told my mom I wasn't going to live that long. She always shrugged it off. I should have died at 12. I'm still here. And really, I shouldn't be. But knowing that, I'm grateful. Happened last night, actually. I have 2 parakeets and at night, I keep their cage covered to keep them warm and block the light out so they can sleep better. They're usually quiet and sleep peacefully through the night. Except for last night. It was around midnight and all of a sudden they started freaking out and flying around the cage, obviously spooked by something. I quickly uncovered the cage so they could see, and they eventually calmed down and settled on their perch again. It reminded me of all those ghost movies I've seen where animals can see/sense demons and stuff that humans can't. I'm sure there's a logical explanation for this, like maybe one of them moved in their sleep and startled the other one, but I don't know. It was definitely unsettling because they never usually do this. 2 events still as clear as day to me, both seemingly not high on the creepy reading spectrum, but they both gave me that "something very weird just happened" feeling. Had a lucid dream where I was on a mountain road with forest on either side of me. There was a fire tornado whipping through the trees on one side. The road was dark and empty except for me and my friend Joe, and it was windy and lee by the fire. Then a small gray figure that kind of resembled Gizmo from the Flintstones, classic little green Martian man with a big helmet, was floating in front of me. We just stared at each other, from what I remember, but it was very eerie the way he was looking at me and I remember the detail of his skin texture even. We were in a sort of clear calm bubble while the fire raged around us. I woke up, having forgotten all about it, poured some cap and crunch berries and turned on the news. The first thing that came on was a report on a raging fire that started overnight in the Shastas. I was living in the mountains south of the Bay Area. In a flash the dream instantly came back to me. I paused mid-crunch, and was just completely weirded out. We were on a midnight hike on an uninhabited island in Lake Michigan that you can only ferry to, no residents, but there are a few abandoned farms from the 1800s and a one-room schoolhouse deep in the middle of the island. We were hiking to the graveyard, so the night was already steeped in superstition and ghost stories. It was so dark out that without the flashlights it was no different if your eyes were closed or open, and we were walking the 1.5 miles to the graveyard without our flashlights. The only way to navigate was to feel with your feet for the edges of the trail, but it was navigable that way, and spooky and fun. Saw some weird green glow off the trail and we all went to check it out. Turns out it was some green glowing fungus, easy to see without the lights but you'd never see it otherwise, and we smeared some on a stick and used it as a mock torch. The rangers didn't believe us when we asked them later. Next we stopped by the schoolhouse so my wife could use the outhouse there, and I wandered a bit ahead of the group, fumbling along the trail in the pitch black so I wouldn't get light blind while she used her light. Then I saw a figure that looked like a lady in a white dress about 10 yards up the trail coming towards me, but not walking, just coming closer, hate to say it but floating. I called out hello and asked if she was lost, really thinking someone was there, just wanting to help. Then the figure evaporated, and I got super freaked out. Called out to the group and one of the guys said it must have been the lady of the lake. I don't believe in ghosts, period, but that happened. There's no getting around it. Then on our way back to the boat ferry the next day to go home we stopped and checked out the island museum, and no, there was a class picture of kids at the schoolhouse from around 1890 and the teacher was a lady in a white dress that died on the island and is sometimes called the lady in the lake. I can't really process this in any other way than a real, true ghost story. I still get goosebumps. When I was young, I went to see my grandpa who happened to be caretaking for a multimillionaire's ranch while the prior caretaker was having rotator cuff surgery. One day he takes me into the prior caretaker's house and a few others and has me flip the breakers off, all of them. I didn't think anything of it at the time, I figured it was maintenance of some type. That night at about 11:30 I was sitting on the couch watching the news and he called me out onto the porch. He points at the caretaker's house, where we turned the breakers off, by the way, but there are 3 lights on. I grab binoculars and look through the windows. No people, no movement, nothing. He looks over at me and says, "That's the 3rd time this week." The first time I went over with my .357 expecting someone to have broken in. But when I got to the house, the door was locked just like I'd left it. I went inside and nothing was out of order except a bar stool was pulled out. Sure enough, we went over, and nothing was out of order except the bar stool. So, I go downstairs to check the breaker box, and the second I open the breaker box, the lights go off upstairs. I quickly widened up and got out of there. Lucky for me, I haven't had too many creepy things occur in my lifetime. However, there is a fairly good one from my childhood, which I've shared before. When I was 9, my parents split up, and my dad rented a house in a pretty isolated part of town. Surrounded by woods, couldn't see any neighbors. It was in a nice area, especially for kids. An old friend of his lived in the basement apartment. He was kind of a weird guy. Super neck beard, into mystic stuff, and hit on my mom constantly when she and my dad were still together. Upstairs, my dad lived with Big Frank, a big teddy bear Viking guy who loved me and my little brother, 5, at the time, and Barney, a deeply religious stagehand who also liked my brother and me a lot. For a while, when my brother and I came to visit Dad, everything was cool. We'd run around in the woods and play games and stay up late and eat junk food. Slowly, I started to feel increasingly creeped out whenever we were there. I'd run to my bed after turning the lights out, because every child knows the bed is the only place you're safe. I constantly felt like something was there. One day, my brother told me his closet door opened in the middle of the night. We didn't tell Dad, probably because he wasn't particularly good at listening to us back then, and we knew he wouldn't take us seriously. Instead, we told Barney. Barney said he'd felt something evil in the house, and he'd do something about it. When everyone else left the house, Barney sprinkled some holy water around, lit some candles, and said a few prayers. The house felt much less scary when we got back that evening, but it went right back to being creepy and awful by the next weekend. Until Dad moved out 5 years later, we just put up with it and pretended not to be scared. It's easy enough to put up with something creepy for a couple of days at a time, as long as nothing actually happens. A couple summers ago, I moved in with Dad and Stepmom. He got married a year after moving out of the house, while going to school. One beautiful evening, we were sitting around playing a game and having a few beers, when my stepmom brought up that house and how filthy it was because a bunch of bachelors lived there. We all laughed and talked about the old roommates and wacky things that happened while they all lived there. Then, I said, bro and I were sure that place was haunted or something. He says his closet door opened in the middle of the night. I never saw anything weird, but God, that place was creepy. My dad nodded and said, yeah. There was some kind of evil presence there. I never told you kids this, but I was pushed down the stairs a few times while going to the basement for laundry. And there was this one time I went to the kitchen, and all our knives were stuck in the ceiling. When I was a kid, 4 to 6 range, my mother had this boyfriend. Let's call him Frank. For the most part he was an okay guy, but he had some serious mental issues which we found out later. At some point they decided to move to Albuquerque, we were in California then, and off we went. Things were okay for a bit, but Franny drank increasingly and was growing increasingly paranoid each day. Eventually my mother found that he had bought plane tickets for himself and a child, me, out of the country. She freaked out and they got into a bit of a tiff that ended up with the police officers arresting him because of attempted kidnapping. She was told he would be in holding for about 4 days, long enough to pack up and leave, but that night the cops decided to let him out. Why? Because he knew how to vomit blood and they freaked out. The cops were not the brightest, and instead of taking him to the hospital they dropped him off at a Walgreens to get his medication, since clearly this guy was no threat. To make things worse, they didn't even bother calling her to warn her that, oh hey, who was planning to kidnap your child is roaming the streets. A few hours later I am asleep in a sleeping bag next to her when I wake up to find his shadowy figure standing over me. He broke in. I scream, she jumps up. She literally throws, him from the room, slams the door and screams for me to lock it. I do. I think anyway, never really came up. They started screaming at each other. The neighbors had already called the police officers at this point because, hey, there was some creep sneaking around this place. At some point during their fighting, she threw him through the sliding glass door. About the same time 2 officers were sneaking around the house to see what was going on. She was arrested and he kept trying to tell them to let me stay with him. I was still locked in the bedroom. Eventually the police officers acquiesce, and she is, while still handcuffed, allowed to convince me to unlock the door. While he is screaming that I would be fine, they find all the evidence of him planning to kill her and taking me to Sweden, where he was born and had dual nationality, so he could somehow keep me away from my grandparents and father. I spent a few days in a CPS house while they sorted her information. It was a weekend which added time, and as soon as she was out we were gone. He kept calling my grandparents' house to tell her he was sorry, and he would be there soon to make things better. Spring break of 2010. My friends and I decided to camp out on an island at a local lake. One night as we were cooking food and drinking beer, a canoe floated by with one guy in it. He asks how we're doing, and we invite him to our island for grilled meat and beers. Being in South Arkansas, we naturally assume that everyone is friendly and wants to hang out. His name was Kurt, and he was super friendly but really seemed to be sad. We asked him what was up, and he replied, "Oh, nothing really, it's just that my friends are probably worried about me." He looked at me and winked. They'll find out soon enough. That still haunts me to this day. Everyone liked Kurt and, noticing that it was getting dark, and he had been drinking, we offered to let him stay with us that night. He declined, saying that he had to get to where he was going, and he seemed very adamant about that. I asked where he was headed, thinking maybe we could give him a ride on a jet ski or something. Kurt ignored the question and said, "You boys don't know how lucky you are." He hopped in his canoe and left. We didn't think much about it. The next morning we woke up early to do some fishing. As we're fishing, a police boat pulls up. The officer asks if we're part of the search party that found the body. We obviously have no clue what he is talking about, so he tells us a story about a young man in a canoe that disappeared last week. Apparently divers found his body at the bottom of the lake 2 days before. The young man's name was Kurt Clark. This was so freaky for us that we all packed up and left camp that day. I have really terrible nightmares a lot. One reoccurring nightmare is about a shadowy figure standing near my bed. It thankfully hasn't happened in a while, but it always starts out the same. In the dream I wake up from my sleep and see this shadowy blur in one corner of my room. I then actually wake up in a little bit of a panic, but eventually fall asleep. In the dream I wake up again, I'm lying in my bed and the shadowy thing is now closer and has formed into the shape of a human. I can never really make out any features, but eventually it's at the foot of my bed just standing there watching me. There's something so menacing about this thing that every time I've had this dream I've woken up shaking and screaming while struggling to turn my lights on in a confused state. In the dream I know this thing shouldn't be there and is going to hurt me, but I can never stop it. I recently got a puppy and now when I have nightmares he moves from his normal spot near my feet and lays next to me while resting his head on my arm and licking my face. It's helped me a lot. I know that this is probably not the type of story you were looking for, but just talking about that nightmare makes me really uneasy.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.